Good morning. Hopefully everybody's doing well. So for today's lesson, we are going to think a bit about our rib cage and how our rib cage can be involved in whatever type of movement we want to do. And the interesting thing is, if we look at the front of our skeleton right here, we can think of there's two big cavities. There's a cavity right here where we have a lot of internal organs. We have the intestines, the stomach, the kidneys, the liver, all kinds of things here. And you can see how the rib cage, particularly in the side and the back where it's a little lower than here, provides a little protection for these areas. Now, the area that the rib cage really protects is the upper cavity. We have a diaphragm right about here that divides. So you can pretend my hand here is the diaphragm, and that's going to divide the lower cavity from the upper cavity. In the upper cavity, we have lungs and heart. Very, very vulnerable areas. We call it a rib cage, and because we call it a rib cage, we tend to think that this cannot move. It's a cage, right? It's a cage, it's a protective shell to keep everything here safe. But if we take a closer look at the rib cage, we can see that it actually is capable of a lot more movement than we think. Okay. So it's interesting, you can't see it, he's stuffed with too much tissue. But down here are, you can call them, they call them the false ribs or the floating ribs. But we have two, and if you want to try to find it on yourself, standing or sitting, you can. But we have two ribs at the very bottom that don't connect into the sternum. So that's why they're called the false rib or the floating rib. And I found one of them. Oh, here's the other one. The other one is just a little bit up on top of it. So if you find the lower border, sometimes it's easier to find the bottom of the sternum, and you can kind of follow it down. And these are the true ribs, because called true because they're attached to the front. But if you go a little lower than this area and a little more toward the back, you may feel those two non-attached ribs, which have, because they're not attached, they have more movement than the upper ribs. And sometimes if people are too vigorous with a movement, those movements can actually pop out of place a little bit. Okay, so let's talk about this front part here, the sternum. And if you want, you can follow on yourself. If you go all the way up here, you can feel a notch. And this little notch is the intersection where your clavicles and your sternum kind of all connect together. So you can find that little notch right up there, and then just take your hand and you can follow all the way down. And this little pointed point here is your xiphoid process. So this is a part they tell you when you learn CPR, not to put your hands down here, but up on the chest mark, because you don't want this part to break off. So one thing that I found really interesting on myself is trying to find the place And if you can kind of feel the space between your ribs, you can kind of follow it inward to feel how wide the sternum is. And the sternum was a lot wider than I thought it was. So you just might want to feel and touch just to feel the width here, the sternum. And then if you do follow the ribs, if you notice that the part that goes toward the sternum is no longer bone, the color changed. So this is bone, but this is more of a connective tissue. So this part is springy and more mobile than this part that connects in. So this connective tissue here is really what affords the ribs a lot of mobility and flexibility, because it's not bone coming all the way to bone here. It's bone, connective tissue, which is a lot more pliable than the bone is, into the rib cage there. And we have 12 ribs, and it's interesting to note that the top rib, and if you follow, if you can find that top ridge, kind of find that notch, go out a little bit below the clavicle, the top ribs go right under the clavicle toward the back of the neck. And then there's 12 of them. And the 12 vertebrae, we're going to turn. 12 vertebrae are going to meet up with the 12 thoracic vertebrae. So the 12 ribs, and it's interesting. It's really quite a fancy connection that you see, the ribs connecting between the two vertebrae and how that all happens. So these are joints too back here that are also quite mobile, and more mobile than we might think. Now, the nice thing about seeing this, you see from this back end how this rib and this rib don't connect to the front. So these are the floating ribs. They're much easier to see in the back, and you're going to be able to feel them more in the back of you than you would in the front of you. As you can see from the skeleton, you can see a lot more from this angle. Okay, let's turn to the front again. We tend to hold this area, particularly if we're anxious, because we want to protect all this. So we just kind of tighten all this up, stiffen it all up to brace ourselves. It's like we're bracing against a shock, and that dampens the movement on the ribs. So if your ribs aren't moving, what parts of you, if you're keeping this part of yourself still, what part of you would have to move more? Well, the part below the knee, which is the lower back, the lumbar area, and a lot of people have problems here. If you're not letting this move, then all the movement has to come here. And you can kind of see which parts are really working and turning a lot up through about here, and it's kind of, it can put a strain there. Now, the other place that has to work a lot, if you're holding the rib cage and you're holding all this in place, would be the cervical vertebrae. So you could see why somebody would have neck or back problems if they didn't allow the rib cage to move freely. And sitting on top of the rib cage, I should mention this. See, it actually detaches from the rib cage, and it's kind of like a coat hanger that just sits right on top of the ribs, and this is your shoulder girdle. And the way the shoulder girdle is going to attach to the rib cage is through the clavicle here. And then the interesting thing about the shoulder blade is it actually slides along the ribs. It's not attached to the ribs. So there's a lot of movement that can happen here. So if we learn how to use the shoulder girdle along with the rib cage, instead of all the work being done just at this one joint, now you can see we have many, 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 many parts of us involved with the movement, which takes a lot of stress and strain off this particular joint right here. And also, if we allow the shoulder girdle and the rib cage, like I want to look up, if I get the movement going like this, and you can see the ribs opening in front and the clavicle rotating upward a little bit, all of this movement helps to lift the head. So the work just isn't being done with the neck. I should move this back so you can see the head. So you can see how all of that can help the neck up. And then if you want to look downward, it's interesting. Now you're going in this direction and you can see the ribs coming together in the front and moving apart in the back. So whatever kind of movement we're doing, our ribs can really help. They're pliable enough to really help with the movement. Side bending movement. So as one side shortens, the other side gets a little longer. As this side moves apart from each other, you can see the other side comes together a little bit. And then finally, rotation. He's going to look over the one shoulder, these ribs, the one part can move forward, the other part can move a little backwards. And you can participate with the movement this way too. Doesn't have to do too much. So we're going to think about all these things as we go through class today. Another thing that's kind of interesting is noticing that this, from the head to the pelvis, is your torso. All of you except for the arms and legs. So notice how much of your torso the rib cage takes up. It takes up a fairly good amount of the real estate between your head and your pelvis. So if all of this is kind of unexplored territory where you don't really know what to do with it, you can see that there's a large chunk of yourself that you're not using and accessing. So hopefully today, after today, it will be a little bit clearer.